In Topic 10, we're starting to look at now that we have some idea of how we measure macroeconomic performance through things like GDP, unemployment, and inflation. And then we have an understanding of how policymakers can manipulate that, or not manipulate, but alter that performance using fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now let's look at the question that really starts modern economic thought, and that is, why are countries different? Why are some countries performing so much worse or so much better than others? So these are the outlines as followed from the chapter. Why do different countries have different standards of living? Why do countries have different levels of unemployment and inflation? And then how do we manage the trade of goods between these countries? That's kind of what we're going to work on here. Hey, look at this. I'm just reading this part of this for the first time here. That would look like a job fair at the Blaisdell if I had to, or maybe a high school. Hawaii Green Jobs Initiative. It could be the Blaisdell. So what is, in this slide, they're basically asking what is the cause of unemployment? Which is interesting that they pick Hawaii as the picture here. In the sense that even among the states within the United States as a country, Hawaii used to have one of the lowest levels of unemployment. It now has one of the highest levels of unemployment. And it's caused largely because of the structure of the economy in Hawaii, which is dependent on hospitality and tourism. Now, outside of the healthcare law here in Hawaii, which does require employers to offer more substantial healthcare coverage than on the mainland, for the most part, Hawaii has pretty relaxed labor laws. There's a few more licensing, and there's obviously union rules, which are a bit more restrictive, but compared to like California or New York, Hawaii is pretty simple. Which means then that the unemployment rate during good economic times is lower than usual. If there were more restrictions, we'd expect it to be higher than the national mean. So if we look at all of the countries in the world, as economists, we tend to separate them according to their GDP per capita, which would be you take the total GDP, which is the production, and you divide it by the number of people. Now, it's not a great way to say how well people are doing. It's not a great way of measuring the standard of living, but it's an approximation. There are things where we could see the GDP per capita being lower, but when you look at these things like health, education, human rights, crime and personal safety, environmental quality, some countries might have a lower standard of living as measured by GDP per capita, but be better off. Well, with that said, low-income countries are those where the per capita income, the approximate level of income per person per year, is less than $1,025. I think you would agree that that is incredibly low income to survive on. A middle-income country would be one where the per capita GDP is between $1,025 and $12,475, with $12,475 being about $1,000 a month. And then in high-income countries, that the per capita GDP exceeds $12,475. Now, how you go from being a low to a middle to a high, how you go from those positions, all depends on, for economists, on investments in labor and investments in capital. That's what's driving all of this. So, if that's what's driving this all, then the question is, how do you encourage those investments to be able to move from low to middle and middle to high? I've already talked about this. Because if we look at high-income countries, which I guess in some sense would be the end goal, most of the population of the world does not live in those high-income countries. It's a not a unique set. Certainly a minority around the world. The majority of the population of the world lives in middle-income countries. But when we look at the total global GDP and how much of the global GDP is captured by high-income population, it's over half of the world's global GDP. Which is why everyone else in the world that doesn't live in a high-income country is grumpy about high-income countries like, United States, like a Canada, like a Japan, like a good number of the countries in Western Europe. The reason why they're grumpy with the United States and others is they're gobbling everything up. And why, if you're a country that's in the middle income, why you aspire to be in that group. So breaking this down a little bit further, not just into the three simple categories, but per capita, not just to high income, middle income, low income. If we start to break it down, basically anything in green, light green, I don't even know what that is. These top three would all be high income, covering a lot of the world. Even Russia at that point, the former Soviet Union, Australia, and parts of South America, Western Europe, United States, Canada. There's certainly imbalance in terms of how this is geographically determined. But I don't want you to think that the environment is causing this. It's not. Why a great deal of sub-Saharan Africa is poor has nothing to do with the fact that it's hot. It doesn't. It's coincidental, if anything. What an economist would argue for why the countries are that you see that are red, dark red, brown, the reason why they are so poor is because they did not make enough investments in capital. Why they didn't make enough investments in capital has to do with civil unrest in the country, political stability in the country, the ability of the country to attract savings from the rest of the world, the population growth rate. All of these things feed into why a country remains poor. And it then becomes the challenge for the leaders in that country to remove those problems in order to become developed. And that's what you start to see here, right? Economic institutions, industrial structure, how old are your people? Geography, more so like how close are you to ports, not geography, is it hot? Now, that would be our growth consensus, what I just explained to you. That most of the differences in the income per person, 70% at least, are explained by differences in the physical capital available, savings and investment. Which means that essentially any economist that a country would hire to say, what should we do to become bigger, would tell you, get investments in savings, get investments in capital, any way you know how. Now, what we can also see, too, is that one other kind of example we see outside of the growth consensus is the East Asian tigers. And with the East Asian tigers, that'd be Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea. What they were able to do is they were able to grow strong. And they did this by exporting a great deal. And they were able then to merge with or converge with high-income countries that they traded with greatly. That export-led industrialization is a little bit harder to pull off these days as it was well, I guess now at this point, 30 years ago at least. And that's just because the global narrative in terms of a country being able to dump their goods on another country in order to fuel exports has changed. And also the foreign currency environment has changed enough so that the East Asian tigers becomes more of an exception than the rule. Which means that the growth consensus remains the primary way that macroeconomists understand growth is occurring. So how do you do this? How do you get the economy to grow? How do you get those investments in capital? How do you get people to do these things? Well, one of the ways you do it is you do it through public policies. You have fiscal policies that encourage investments. You have monetary policy that's stable and that encourages long-term investment by having a good stable inflation rate and a stable interest rate. I'm not going to waste your time looking at these kinds of things here. So if you're a middle-income economy, how you do this is, generally speaking, is that you focus a lot on education. You highly educate your workers so that that human capital represents something that the workers are more valuable, and that the work then is done in that country to then be exported elsewhere. They have the technology present to then export it elsewhere. You don't want to become then too dependent on a company coming in, investing in machines, and then when things change, they move those machines to another country. You want the most valuable capital to be actual workers, which are actually a little bit less mobile than the machines. And one of the challenges that's also then faced in countries that are in these middle income economies is that they typically, from their development era, they had a banking and financial sector which was outdated and was restrictive. And basically, it can hold the economy back. The country needs to shed this. They need to liberalize their economic and financial system in order to promote capital investment. These are the poorest countries of the world. What is common among many of these is instability. Instability that causes a lack of investment. Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Eritrea, Burundi, Liberia, Zimbabwe, the Congo, all countries that have internal civil wars, instability, or just unstable financial system and unstable political system. You don't want to do business in these countries if you don't have to. And it becomes unfortunate because it forces those countries to remain poor. And as the country remains poor, it then also then remains unstable. Now, when we look at that stability, we see it in high-income countries. We don't see it in low-income countries. And to be able to improve that, you need to work with the macroeconomic officials to get a stable and consistent policy for inflation and for interest rates. You need stable laws, constitution. You need those things in order to attract investment, to make people think that the rule of law is going to reign true. And if you don't, the people in those countries will remain poor, as they are in this pretty sad-looking picture. And what tends to happen here is that when you're in a low-income country, all you're trying to do is survive, naturally. So because these people are just focusing on surviving, they're only buying necessities. They're not saving. Or certainly if they're saving, they're not saving in the country that they live in because they don't trust the funds to remain there. And so when you think about what foreign aid does, not that I'm trying to give credit to those who say that we shouldn't give money to other people, but there is an extent to which there's some foreign aid that helps and there's some foreign aid that does not. We might think that foreign aid that helps more would be something like the Peace Corps or, I don't know, entrepreneurs or, I don't know, something where you're helping build the infrastructure in that economy. You're helping promote stability. You're not necessarily helping the economy prosper when you just give food. Yeah, at the same time, people need to survive to the next day. So it's not like you shouldn't give food. Now, when you look at the unemployment rate across countries, you do see that the same rules apply across all countries. You can use fiscal and monetary policy to alter the cyclical level of unemployment. But one of the differences between, even among high-income countries, is that there's a distinctive difference in their natural rates of unemployment. And again, it's caused by the rules and restrictions. Western Europe being a set of countries that's notorious for having lots of rules and restrictions that make it very expensive to have employees, which is then why the official unemployment rate's rather high, but in actuality, people are working, they're just working under the table. Yet they still would be counted as unemployed. And that's also too what you see in developing countries as well, is that even in poor countries, the unemployment rate might be high, but it's just that people are working under and outside of the system. They're doing things, they're doing home production for themselves, they're bartering, they're trading, or they're just not engaging in the market economy as much as is done in a modern market economy like our own. And that's not very good, though, because the consequence of that is that if they're not connected to the labor market very strongly, then they also do not, firms do not specialize their labor, meaning that we suffer from lack of productivity, but that also we face problems with the social network, the social capital, the financial infrastructure being underdeveloped because there's not a lot of money flowing through things. And just as there's the differences in the unemployment, there's also the differences in inflation across countries. And we see that by failing to control inflation, you will not get the investment you need in that country. And by not getting that investment that you need in the country, you will remain a developing economy. Why is that the case? Why are there different inflation rates? Primarily because in low and middle income economies, the common problem is that leaders within that country just printed too much cash. They just kept printing and printing and printing cash and causing huge budget deficits that are then maintained and paid for by the central bank just paying it off by printing more cash, which causes inflation and causes all of the remaining problems. And then one of the other things that a low and middle income country can do, as difficult as it is, they need to just reduce the barriers to trade. They need to encourage the production done in their own country to appeal to whatever their comparative advantage is. And then trade for the other goods. Again, it's going to cause one problem. It's going to mean that you're going to have unemployed people in certain affected industries. But you need to compensate for that. You need to go over that. You need to reduce it as far as you can. But you need to kind of inform the population that this is needed in order for there to be long-term economic growth. And again, it's going to be tough to do, but it needs to be done. So what this then creates here is it creates a heightened importance to how international capital is, how capital is flowing across international borders. And what we see is that high-income countries tend to export more than they import most of the time. And so then they invest in the rest of the world. And low and middle income countries tend to import more than they export. And so because of that, they need to bring in lots of foreign capital, which then again further reduces the ability of the country, of the low and middle income country, to develop financial capital within their own borders. They're just overly dependent then on getting the capital from others. There's Greece, although this is dated by this point, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. So where do we start then? You know, how do we make this less depressing of a discussion? And it really then means, as the first bullet point identifies here, you focus on the people, making sure that they had good health and good education. That's then, so the human capital formation. And then from there, you focus on merging physical capital with the human being workers that you have to be able to have a strategy for economic growth. Okay.